Ask an Atheist program. I'm Annie Laurie Gaylor, co-president of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, coming to you live from FFRF studio in Freethought Hall, our office building in downtown Madison, Wisconsin.
And I'm Mark Dan, Director of Governmental Affairs at FFRF, coming to you from Washington, D.C. Today we're talking with Wisconsin State Senator Kelda and Ron Millar about how non-believers are gaining ground in legislatures across the country, why that's critical for our movement, how we're pushing back against the Christian Nationalist legislative agenda.
Wisconsin State Senator Kelda is an American tech entrepreneur, business owner, attorney, and Democratic politician. She currently serves in the Wisconsin State Senate, representing the 26th Senatorial District, and that's my district. This senator was elected in 2020 after previously serving 2 terms in the Wisconsin State Assembly. She was a candidate for governor of Wisconsin in 2018. Senator Royce is also an attorney and the former executive director of NARAL Pro-Choice Wisconsin. Senator Royce can be found on Twitter at keldahelenroyce.us. And Senator Royce, you're our first in-studio guest since the pandemic started, so we're delighted to have you here.
Great to be with you, Annie Laurie. Thank you.
And I do have to ask, when is your due date?
I'm due at the end of September with baby number 3.
Well, we're delighted to have you here.
Thank you.
Great, thrilled that you're here, Senator, with us. And also our second guest today is Ron Millar, who runs the Political Action Committee Freethought Equality Fund, whose mission is to achieve equality for non-theistic community by increasing the number of open non-believers in public office at all levels of government. Ron was instrumental in the announcement by Representative Jared Huffman that he is a humanist and agnostic, and in the establishment of the Congressional Freethought Caucus. Ron can be found on Twitter at CTR Freethought. Thanks, Ron, for joining us for today's conversation.
Thank you very much for having me. Really appreciate it.
Great.
So if you have questions for Senator Royce or Ron Millar, please ask them in the Facebook comments or send an email to askanatheist@ffrf.org. And remember, FFRF is a 501c3 nonpartisan educational group. So not only do we happily accept your tax-deductible donations, but we are also not and cannot take sides in partisan elections and don't necessarily endorse any such views that might be expressed here.
Ron, let's first get an overview of the importance of the elected nuns who say they have no religious affiliation. After the 2020 election, there are now over 80 elected officials who identify with the atheist and humanist communities, and that number continues to grow each year. Why are so many more of the nuns running for office, and how have you helped in that process?
Thanks. Well, I think there's 4 major factors. One is demographics. Just our community is growing rapidly, so naturally more folks are getting involved in politics and running for office. The second major thing is just normalizing being an atheist and humanist for public consumption, which is something FFRF has done great work on, and also our other secular atheist and humanist allied groups. So you got the demographics, you got the normalization, and then you look at our current political situation where one major party is captured by Christian nationalism. And so, you know, if we don't get involved in politics now, I don't know what would motivate us. And finally, you know, I'm asking the question of candidates and elected officials if they're members of our community, and I don't think anyone has systematically done that at the federal and state level before. So, you know, when we started in 2016, we knew of 5 state legislators who identified with our community, and now, like you're saying, there are 60. So a lot of that is just reaching out, showing that there is a community here, and offering people the opportunity to identify and be their authentic selves.
Great. And it seems that in survey after survey, it's levels of trust of different groups of people, and who do you trust the least? And often non-believers come pretty low in that area. But we're starting to see more momentum. So is being an out on non-believer a big deal in a political campaign?
We thought we would have more attacks on candidates, actually, and that really hasn't happened. I was talking with a candidate in West Texas for the 2018 election cycle, and he was in this really red district, and he said, "Oh, I can't possibly come out as an atheist." He said, "I lose 2/3 of the voters just by being a Democrat, more by being pro-choice, and even more by being LGBTQ friendly." And I was thinking, well, who else are you afraid of losing? So we bought some time on an election day poll to really answer that question. And it turned out that people are much more focused on issues and policy, and religious factors are dropped really way down. So I mean, that was important to show people that, people aren't as concerned about you being an atheist or a humanist or an agnostic. There's still a bias there, of course. Even with people who were pro-choice, voted Democratic, were LGBTQ friendly, there was between 10 and 12% of the population that would look less favorably on an atheist or a humanist or an agnostic candidate. But the fact is that that's just an unknown candidate. That when you put a face and name to it, we find that doesn't even hold up. Jared Huffman's been through 2 election cycles now as an agnostic, and his numbers haven't dropped at all. So the only attack that we've had was against Gail Jordan, who's active in our community, and she ran for the Tennessee State House. She ran in 2016. Religion didn't come up. The incumbent won re-election, but she put on a great campaign. Then in 2017, the incumbent took a position with the Trump administration, and so the seat vacated. She ran in the special election, and then her atheism was brought up. The lieutenant governor critiqued her, the head of the Tennessee GOP, and her opponents. But what's interesting from all the attacks that happened, her percentage of the vote actually went up from her 2016 endeavor. So again, it really isn't proving to be an obstacle for candidates. The key thing to get through is people's perception that it might be a problem, and that's what we have to educate people about.
That's fantastic, and we all know Gail, and she is a really strong candidate, and I think that's wonderful that we can count her in our midst. So, Annie Laurie.
Yeah, so we have one of these success stories in the studio with us, Senator Kelda Roys. And Kelda, how do you identify in terms of religion?
Well, I have been a secular humanist and an atheist since I think my teen years. I was raised Unitarian Universalist, and one of the wonderful things about being raised in that tradition is that you really have the opportunity to learn about all the world's religions and become literate in different religious traditions. I was also raised by celebrating a lot of the Jewish holidays and sort of in that culture with my dad. So, I had a lot of exposure to religion. I was very curious. I read a lot, and I think ultimately, for me, I think that spirituality is something that's disconnected from organized religion. And I feel very lucky that I had that opportunity as a young person to really explore my own beliefs with respect to religion. And I think, all young people would benefit from having the ability to do that.
Yeah, being able to grow up and make up your own mind once you're old enough to understand all of this.
And to really learn and be exposed to the fact that, there's just a tremendous diversity of thought when it comes to religion and spirituality and, things like tradition and culture.
So you come from a district where we know from the 2010 census about 53% identifies having no religion.
Wow.
Here in Dane County.
I didn't realize it was that high, my goodness.
Yes, and I hope FFRF has had some role in that. We don't know. But is there any downside? Have you had any awkward moments? Do you have any battle scars related to your views on religion as a public official?
Well, I mean, I definitely have had people nervous about me talking about the fact that I am not a theist and, nervous about what that might mean for my political career. But I think, ultimately people want someone who they think will advocate for them and for the issues that they care about. And as a Democrat and a progressive in a district that pretty well suits me, it hasn't been an issue. But certainly if I were running statewide, that would be probably a little bit trickier to navigate that. And then that's when I would sort of say, well, I'm a lot of things. I'm a mom. I'm a small business owner. My spouse and I live in ways that I think you guys would all probably recognize. We want our kids to be honest and kind and compassionate and empathetic. We want to take care of the earth. And we share those similar values regardless of how we may differ in terms of our religious beliefs.
So you did run for statewide office, actually.
I did.
So did the religion issue come up then?
It didn't come up very much. I was running in the Democratic primary for governor, and in the course of that campaign, I actually ended up breastfeeding my daughter in a campaign ad, and that was really the issue that that captured people's attention and got just a tremendous amount of media attention. And so I guess after that, it just nothing else was really controversial.
Well, I certainly admire your ability to nurse your baby like that in what might be considered, some nerve-wracking moment, and there you are.
Well, nothing's more nerve-wracking than a crying baby.
That's true.
So it's like anything you can do to just say, okay, calm down, it's going to be fine.
So any other thoughts about when you hear about all the other public officials out there who are not religious state legislators? I mean, this is a big change.
It's a huge change. I was in the assembly, between 2008 and 2012, and at that time, there was very little discussion at all about free thinkers. It was just assumed that religion was dominant. They ask you the question about what religion you are in the state blue book. And I think it's really important. This is an issue where the public is so far ahead of elected officials, as is often the case.
Yes.
All of us know people, even if we're a member of a religious community, who are not religious or might identify as atheist or agnostic. And we can find a way to live and work and be families and be in community with people who think differently from us. And that should be the lesson that legislators take.
Well, we're very admiring of public officials who come out of the closet this way. And in many of your campaigns, you have been endorsed by groups like the Center for Freethought Equality, the Pro-Choice Emily's List. How important is that early endorsement when you're running as a candidate?
I think it's very, very important. It's often hard especially if you're running in a lower profile race like a state legislative race that's not going to get the kind of big attention that a statewide race is going to get. You have to do something to get your name out there and to build a community of supporters. Obviously I always wanted to be supported by people who want to be represented by someone who's a progressive Democrat. And I'm really proud that I've had support from Republicans and from moderates in every campaign that I've run. But obviously the core group of people who are going to back you and help you be successful and get across the finish line are the people who most passionately agree with you and want to see their values represented in government.
Well, we sure do. If you have questions for Senator Kelda Roys from Wisconsin and Ron Millar from the Center for Freethought Equality, ask them in the Facebook comments or send an email to askanatheist@ffrf.org.
And Kelda, the past legislative session across the country has just been described as brutal, with several hundred anti-abortion, LGBTQ, or so-called religious liberty bills. In Wisconsin, there were 8 anti-abortion, 3 anti-LGBTQ, 2 bills that seek broader religious exemptions from COVID vaccines, and 1 to expand vouchers. Clearly, that is an awful lot to do in a legislative session from your opposition. And what's one of the strongest memories you have from this year's legislative session in your fight against these types of bills?
Well, I have a lot. I mean, we are certainly in Wisconsin seeing the kind of national effect of very right-wing legislation being pushed. I remember one particular bill that would have attacked the University of Wisconsin Medical School and prohibited them from offering the opportunity for the medical students to do a rotation at Planned Parenthood because Planned Parenthood provided abortions. And that was a very dangerous and problematic bill for many reasons. But I felt compelled to testify because, as I said, I'm the only legislator, I believe, who's pregnant. And the chair of the committee, who is a man, said, well, hold on now a second. My wife is pregnant. And I was like, well, isn't that exactly the point, right? It's different when it's your own body. And I'm the legislator and I'm the pregnant one. And then later in that same committee hearing, he asked if I knew what a fetus was. And, that kind of just
patronizing.
Yeah, dismissiveness of a colleague. He's a senator, I'm a senator. And I just think, to show that kind of disregard for a colleague or just for another person, even if I was just a member of the public coming to testify, I just can't imagine, treating someone with that kind of derision. And it really underscored for me how easy it is to dehumanize people who have a different belief. Obviously he doesn't see my viewpoint as valid, and that's fine. We can have a disagreement about that. But he didn't even think that I, really was worthy of being considered as a person. And I think, that the ability to dehumanize people who think differently than you makes it much easier to pass these kinds of terrible legislations that attack women, that attack LGBTQ people, even teens and young people.
Yeah.
And I do have one follow-up question there. We're in Wisconsin where we have not been able to get rid of the statute criminalizing abortion.
That's right.
For physicians who would, I think, have to be put in jail for up to 6 years and massive fines. If the Supreme Court were to turn the abortion issue back to the states, it would immediately become illegal here. And it doesn't look like we can, it looks hopeless right now under the current legislature to repeal that, doesn't it?
It does. And this is something that I've fought, back from when I was the executive director of NARAL Pro-Choice Wisconsin. We knew that Roe v. Wade has always been under threat, and that the minute we lost the protection of the Supreme Court, that in Wisconsin women would be, become criminals, basically, if they were going to try to have an abortion, and that doctors could be turned into felons. Yeah, it's a very dangerous situation. That's why we need fair maps.
Fair maps,
because
yes.
It doesn't reflect how people in Wisconsin feel. This is a pro-choice state. We are a purple state, but we are a blue-tinged purple state. And the way that our state legislature has been
gerrymandered,
absolutely hacked, is totally anti-democratic.
Well, and this is another reason why at the federal level we need to pass, and I'm going to forget the name of it.
The For the People Act.
For the People Act, and also, Mark, what is it? Is it EACH, or the act that would make sure that states can't compromise abortion rights?
Yes.
The acronym is I'm forgetting it, but
it is slipping my name as well.
but
Unfortunately, I apologize
important.
for that.
Well, and so that brings us, Ron, to the whole idea of the threat of Christian nationalism, that we're seeing all of these bills at the state level, so many threats. And how have you seen the non-religious who are elected rally against the threat of Christian nationalism?
Well, I do Google alerts on all our elected officials who identify with us, and it is really, inspiring to see what people are doing, working on the issues that we concern about, addressing climate change, protecting the integrity of science with, make sure we're teaching evolution, protecting reproductive rights, going against school vouchers, and promoting medical aid in dying. And so, our folks are taking leadership positions, but I'm all about building organizations and institutions. So one thing that happened late last year was we helped set up the Association of Secular Elected Officials. And so that group's going to be promoting model legislation to our elected officials and allies. And we've had 3 or 4 workshops already. Allison Gill from American Atheist promoted her Project Blitz materials. And then our next presentation is going to be from a state senator in Arizona, Victoria Steele, who has model legislation on removing the clergy privilege when it comes to making a mandatory reporting of child abuse. So, we want to create networks, community, to get people working together. It's also great. Sarah Levin, who you probably know from the Secular Coalition for America, is organizing state democratic groups. And we've had in foundational meetings or organizing meetings, we've had our state legislators who identify with us speak at those meetings and become excited about having the atheist and humanist community organizing politically and getting involved. So, we just want to build that community. And of course, Jamie Raskin is going to be on the select committee to investigate the January 6th insurrection, which he has deep concerns about Christian nationalism, and I'm sure that will come to the forefront from the investigations that they'll be leading. So
Ron, you were really very influential in helping to make sure that the Congressional Freethought Caucus started, weren't you? And Jamie Raskin is co-chair, co-founder of the Congressional Freethought Caucus in D.C. and Congress, with about 15 members now. Didn't you play a role in that?
We did. When Jared Huffman was talking about announcing that he was an agnostic and humanist, we sort of went through a litany of things we would love to see happen, and on that was a caucus within Congress. So when we had dinner with him, we pitched multiple ideas, and that one took because when he made his announcement, he had a bunch of people come up to him and saying, how brave it was for you to do this. We really want to be supportive. And Huffman, said, well, why don't we form a caucus? And so we had a meeting at his townhouse with several members of Congress and Royce Beckhardt and myself, and we went, through all the various paperwork that needed to be put together. And so it exists. We hope to keep it growing. We got to keep reaching out to members of Congress to get them to join up, because we need as many allies on this as possible.
So I have suggested to Representative Huffman, who's got plenty on his plate already, that it would be wonderful if the Congressional Freethought Caucus could seed state-level Freethought caucuses as the Congressional Prayer Caucus has done. And of course, the Congressional Prayer Caucus is what's behind Project Blitz, so which is the blitz at the state level to pass all this Christian nationalist legislation entangling religion and government. So maybe that's on my wish list. I don't know if that's on your wish list.
Definitely. I would love to see state-level caucuses come together. We have someone in New Hampshire, because New Hampshire has this huge legislature, and we have a dozen or so people who identify with us, and so they're looking into creating a state caucus. Francesca Hong and Melissa Agard is there in Wisconsin. So there's potential now, because we have enough people out there to start those types of things. And Jared Huffman started it with just having one member who was out himself with our community, and he was able to form a caucus. So,
and of course,
we
should note that the Congressional Freethought Caucus doesn't require the members to be freethinkers. Only Jared Huffman is proclaimed as a non-believer there, but they are in favor of the rights of freethinkers and in favor of separation of church and state.
Exactly. We can't move forward without allies, and so we got to build up our ally base as much as we build up our own members, being public, being authentic about who they are.
Right. And so we also have a question from the audience for Senator Royce from Kevin Glover. And he writes, Senator Royce, do you still have an issue with Democratic colleagues taking issues with do you have an issue with Democratic colleagues taking an issue with secularism? Because I feel like the party hasn't given secular voters enough recognition despite being more pluralistic than the GOP. Is that accurate?
Well, I think that's a great question. I have not experienced that. I feel very supported by my Democratic colleagues in most things, although, one of the great things about being a Democrat is that you get to make up your own mind. And so we have a big tent, and, I'm allowed to be the lone vote against bills that all the other Democrats vote for. And that happens on a not infrequent basis. It's not like the Republicans, where it's pretty much lockstep and you're told how to vote. And if you don't vote that way, you'll get a primary. I do think that having some increased visibility for free thinkers and for other religious minorities, in the same way that we've sort of become more culturally attuned to the fact that not everyone is Christian. I think that's a good thing. It's a good thing for all Americans so that we can all feel welcomed and like we have a stake in our government, and our government isn't trying to impose one particular religious belief on our whole society. I mean, that is the basis for this country. And so we definitely have more work to do in terms of making sure that government reflects the freedom of religion that is our birthright as Americans.
If you have questions for Senator Kelda Roys, who is from Wisconsin, and Ron Millar from the Center for Freethought Equality, you can ask that through Facebook, make comments on Facebook, or send an email to askanatheist@ffrf.org. And Kelda, in 2022, Wisconsin's going to be home of a governor's race, a Senate race,
Yes.
You name it, everybody's up.
Everybody's
half the Senate,
except
half
me.
the state Senate, and is it everybody in the Assembly?
Yes.
So Wisconsin's going to be ground zero. Any thoughts on this?
Well, we have our work cut out for us. I mean, Wisconsin is a state that has a great progressive tradition, and when we have high voter turnout, when people show up to vote, Democrats win. And that's why all of our statewide elected officials are Democrats. We have Democratic governor, lieutenant governor, our state constitutional officers, and of course the great Tammy Baldwin in the United States Senate. That said, we also have a very, very right-wing strain in our state, and they have been able to capture ill-gotten power that really is not earned by gerrymandering the state legislature and by making changes to the voting laws to make it more difficult and challenging for people to exercise their freedom to vote, and changing the campaign finance rules. So one of the things that I'm really excited about is that we are able now, with higher vaccination rates, to get back to doing the in-person door-to-door campaigning, because that on-the-ground organizing is the best antidote to the kinds of big money organized efforts that we see from the right wing to try to, hold back progress in our state.
Well, it's going to be a nail biter, I'm afraid.
It is, and I'm going to be out there knocking on doors, probably with a baby strapped to my back, and doing my part to make sure that our state goes blue.
That's fantastic. And you mentioned this a little bit earlier, but in Wisconsin, the state legislature draws the congressional and state district boundaries, and then the governor can veto them. What is your timeline for the new legislative districts to go into effect, and what do you think those outcomes are going to be?
Well, fortunately, we have divided government right now, and so the Republicans don't get to do what they did 10 years ago and pass the worst gerrymandered maps in the nation. Governor Tony Evers has already said that if maps are not fair, if people don't have a fair opportunity to elect an official of their choice, then he's going to veto them, and he's going to veto any attempts to restrict our freedom to vote. So that's a great thing. We do think that the new maps will be drawn probably by the courts, because the Republicans are not going to give up their power easily, and Evers won't rubber stamp it. So that will end up in the courts, and I think that means that there's going to be a lot of opportunities for Democrats around the state to win, because the demographics of our state just do not support a 60%, 40% Republican majority.
Yeah, and I think no matter how you feel about politics or anything, the idea that a minority party can routinely win control and have less votes just strikes, I would imagine, whether you're liberal or conservative or all points in between, as grossly unfair.
That's exactly right. My father-in-law is Republican and lives in Maryland, and we talk about this all the time. We don't agree on very much politically, but we definitely both agree that gerrymandering is bad, because it keeps him out of having any power in Maryland and me out of having any power in Wisconsin. Now, I should say Wisconsin's gerrymander is actually far worse than Maryland's, but yeah, we should, democracy means making messy decisions with people that you disagree with. That's the only way that we can have self-government that's functional.
And also, we have a question from our audience, Ann Benedictson from Iowa. She says, well, Iowa, a formerly purple state, conservatives now control the House, the Senate, and the executive branches. For a while, nonbelievers had hope that we could change things, but now it seems hopeless. Can you give us any reason to think more nonbelievers can win elections in Iowa or other similar states?
Well, I I always think there's hope, or I could not get out of bed in the morning and do what I do. I mean, I have to tell you, 10, 12 years ago, my spouse and I decided to go to Iowa to get married because Iowa had marriage equality, and we did not want to be married in a state like Wisconsin that had discrimination written into its constitution. Of course, this was before the Supreme Court ensured marriage equality nationwide. And, we traveled to Iowa and, got our application, and it said spouse and spouse rather than husband and wife. And, it was just such a wonderful feeling that, he and I just felt like, look at what Iowa can do. Why can't Wisconsin do that? So politics ebbs and flows, and the Republicans have been so disciplined in large part because they have these very, very organized right-wing conservative religious organizations that are putting all of their might and their wealth into these political movements. And, we are very far behind in terms of organizing. So whether you're just someone who believes in the separation of church and state, if you're like the founding fathers and you think that's an important part of being American, or whether you're secular or agnostic, or you're a member of a religious minority, we have to get together and stand up and say that these attempts to take over our government and implement one particular religious faith is really un-American. And we have to be proud of the fact that we are standing up for the very liberties that make this country great.
Hear, hear.
So you can win in Iowa.
So Ron, what are the best ways that people like that caller can help out non-theistic candidates?
Sure. Go to our website at the Center for Freethought Equality, and we have activism guides, talks about what you can do as an individual, as a 501c3 organization to engage our community and be more politically active. I think the key thing for an individual, though, is figure out what is it worth to have candidates and a democracy and a government that you're proud of, and then budget your time and your money on how much you're willing to invest in that. And so you educate yourself, you get engaged, you financially support candidates that are going to be working on your behalf, and then you volunteer your time. So door knocking, like you're saying, phone banking. There's texting now for people who are not like myself, and so there's just great ways to reach out to candidates and to the voters to get them organized. I mean, I live in Virginia, and we went from a red to a purple to a blue state. And it really was because people got engaged. People took on every race, not just the ones they thought they could win, because you have to challenge the narrative that's out there. Otherwise, the voters just think, well, that must be the way it is. But if you challenge it, you get people thinking, you get people organized, you get people engaged. You can turn it around. And it really is just how much you're willing to commit to do that.
And Senator Royce, has there been a time where you've been able to turn around a candidate or a voter who may not be thinking like you, or how did you get them to change their mind?
Well, I can't say I've changed people's mind on fundamental policy issues like whether or not women should have the right to choose, but I have been able to get people who think very differently from me to end up voting for me. And I think fundamentally, what all of us want in a democracy is we want to be listened to. We want to have our viewpoint respected and heard. And so when I was knocking on doors to talk with voters, I just said, hi, my name is Kelda Royce. I'm running for state assembly, I'm running for state senate, and I'd like to know what's important to you. And then I just shut up. It's that thing where you just take a drink of water and you wait for that awkward pause for the voter to say, well, blah, 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 and when you listen to someone and you give them that space, and especially in like a one-on-one or a small group environment, you're able to have, you're led into some very special circle of trust when they tell you what's important to them. And so even someone who thinks very differently from me said, you're the one who came to my door, you asked for my vote, and you listened to me. And that's why, my office, we try to respond to every single letter that we get, even from people that are never going to be on the same side of most issues. And I think that, really that is what politics is about. And it's the hardest and the most important part of being in a democracy.
Go ahead, Mark.
So just kind of following through on that, we actually have an audience question from our legal director, Rebecca Markert. When you're lobbied by religious groups, how do you handle that as a non-theist? And how do you handle the opening prayer?
Well, the opening prayer is really tough. I mean, I think it's unconstitutional as it is. As it is being practiced right now. I wouldn't mind having an opening moment of silence or, poetry, or even, something that comported with what the Supreme Court has said. But instead, what we have is almost exclusively Christian prayer that makes specific and repeated references to, specific names and Jesus Christ and things like that. And I think it's so disrespectful to the people of this state, and not just to non-believers and non-Christians, but to Christians. The idea that, religion is special because people can choose it freely. And the minute that it's mandated, it becomes polluted. The minute the government is coercing people in that direction or giving its imprimatur, then religion is no longer something that is a matter of free thought and conscience. And I don't understand why more Christians aren't up in arms about this. So I stay out of the chamber. I do not go, and that was true when I was in the assembly. In the assembly there were other folks. There were Jewish people and others who also stayed out. But I think I'm the only one in the Senate who withdraws myself physically from that. And it's very unfortunate. I mean, that's another thing that you can do is you can go to your school board meeting or your city council meeting and make it friendlier, not just for elected officials to be out as non-believers, but to make it friendly for everyone in the community to attend by, not having that prayer, especially an explicitly Christian prayer. There are a lot of other ways that you can mark the solemnity of the occasion without violating our Constitution.
And that's really why the Freedom from Religion Foundation started. My mother and I were complaining about prayers at the Madison City Council and Dane County Board, and that did change things. They had an inspirational moment at Dane County, and they dropped prayers at the city. But we also, one of our earliest lawsuits was suing over the paid prayers. In those days, it was $10 for clergy. This is the 1970s, and then they got a parking.
That was good money in the 70s.
Yeah. And then they got up. There was a reserved parking place for them, and that case in federal court languished for 5 years in James Doyle Sr.'s federal courtroom. He was so overburdened. And then the Marsh decision came down that Senator Ernie Chambers took from Nebraska, and that kind of threw our case out. And then, of course, we've had subsequent decisions, but we would love to sue over something like that again if we could figure out a way to do it. Because it's such an injury to you that you have to absent yourself from your chamber so that you are not, your conscience isn't violated.
Well, and I do it because I think it's wrong for the people of Wisconsin. And it's interesting because there was just a bill in a committee that I'm on mandating the playing of the national anthem before all sporting events. And beyond the idea that, my 3-year-old playing t-ball is considered a sporting event, apparently, according to this bill. Obviously, anybody's never seen a 3-year-old with a baseball bat. The idea that we should be coercing people into kind of performative acts, whether it's patriotism or particular religious practices, I just think it is so profoundly un-American. If we have an idea that this country is founded on liberty and freedom and these, wonderful values that we aspire to and, certainly have not lived up to throughout our history, we should not be passing laws or creating public spaces that are so exclusionary and coercive that make people feel like, oh, I'm not welcome in the Capitol, even though that's the people's house.
Right. I'm an outsider.
Right.
I'm not subscribing to the orthodoxy.
Right. We are all welcome in this House, in the Capitol, and that's how it should be.
And when you talk a lot about dignity and respect, and when you went to testify and belittled by essentially your coworker, have you seen that? Has there been an increase in that lack of compassion, in that lack of respect for other legislators? Has that been increasing, decreasing, or about the same since when you arrived in the legislature?
Unfortunately, I think it's gone down over the last 10 years, and I think Scott Walker played a big role in that. The former governor of Wisconsin, they had the votes, and they were able to pass any priority that they wanted. They could implement any policy, but they chose to do it. He chose to do it in the most divisive way possible, breaking all the rules and breaking all the norms. And he really paved the way for Donald Trump. And then, of course, living through the Trump administration in this country, I think, has almost irreparably broken the idea that we even can come together. People from different perspectives, and I don't know how we're going to recover from that. I mean, we have to hold the people who wanted to take down our democracy and our authoritarianism. We have to hold them accountable. We have to expose it. We have to continue to say, this is truth, this is factual, and this is a lie, and this is propaganda. And I think, it's very, very hard to come together when you have policy disagreements on things like taxes if you don't share a willingness to sort of live in the same
reality.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's crucial. I'm so glad that Pelosi did appoint this commission and that Jamie Raskin is part of it.
Yes.
And speaking of January 6th, so Maria Lorge asked, how worried are you about the rise in Christian nationalism and what right-wing extremism, especially since the January 6th insurrection?
Well, I think it's a huge national security concern, and it has been for many years. I mean, if you talk to national security experts, they say that this is one of the most significant threats to our country. And I think the January 6th insurrection and sort of events before and after have really exposed, wow, we're actually a lot further down that scary road towards authoritarianism than maybe we thought. I think we've always sort of looked at how other democracies have failed or withered or become, democracies only in name, Turkey and, South American countries. And we think, well, that couldn't really happen here. But in fact, it can. And it's things like concerted efforts by right-wing and religious extremists to enter the military or enter law enforcement or positions of power and enter politics so that they can have mainstream influence on those organizations and kind of embed themselves. And I think that is very scary because we want our institutions to protect all of us and above all to protect our democracy. And it is very frightening to think about how close we are because we still haven't reckoned with just that moment in time when we could have easily lost our democracy, and we are still way too close to the edge for comfort.
We certainly are, and the midterms are going to be so important in the future.
Yes.
How this is going to be handled.
Everybody has to be out there knocking on doors, not just me.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I think when we take a look at how our democracy moves forward and what citizens can do, Mike asks to Ron, are there any Republican atheist candidates that you know of? And do you think there can be fertile ground within the GOP for more non-believer candidates?
Well, there is a strong libertarian bent within the Republican Party, but the one state representative who was Republican identified with us felt that he had to leave the party and become a libertarian and then lost his seat. So currently, I don't know of any. And then when you look at the litany of the issues that we care about, these are all things that are only really issues because the Christian Nationalists refuse to accept climate change, don't want women to control their own bodies, don't want people to make their end-of-life decisions. I mean, they're only policy issues because of the Christian nationalists making them so. These shouldn't be what we're focusing on. We should be solving these issues. But that changes at the local level, and where it really is nonpartisan, and there are Republicans, and you're dealing with stop signs in libraries, and so you can have Republicans at that level who don't have to deal with the Christian nationalist influence upon them. So
I think that's a very important perspective to keep in mind of how all politics is local. And Kelda, for a final thought, as we can't wait to wait your arrival of your third child, if you can think about 20 years in the future, what type of future do you hope that they'll have, and how do you think we can get there?
Well, that's a big question. I mean, I hope it's a future where we have the political capacity in this country to address the most important and pressing issues. That we have a political system that allows us to say the climate crisis is existential and we must act now. Where we have a democracy where voting rights are secure and it's not partisan or controversial, who gets to cast a ballot and who doesn't, and who has an easy, no-line, opportunity to vote 10 different ways, absentee or at their clerk's office or Dropbox, and then who has to jump through 100 hoops. There are so many public policy issues I care about. I'd love to have health care for all. I'd love to see, trans youth not have a, shameful suicide rate and be bullied by our elected officials. I would love to see, Wisconsin not be the worst place for a black child. But if we're going to address all of these public policy failures, we have to have a political system that allows people to come together and that encourages that. And unfortunately, we're so far from being able to even address these crises in our political system because it gives outsized power to a political minority group. And that's true at the federal level with the way the Senate is composed and with the packing of the Supreme Court by Mitch McConnell and by and the whole federal judiciary and the Electoral College and how it influences our president. And it's also true at the state level because of gerrymandering and voter suppression. So those are the issues that have to be addressed so that we can actually build the world where all of our kids have the opportunity to live to the fullest of their dreams and to make their own choices, make their own mistakes. That's what all of us deserve as Americans. And I think to some extent we're promised, and we have to make sure that we do our best to fix it so that my kids don't have to keep fighting the same fights.
Yes. Well, that's a good note to end on, Kelda. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And that's all for this week's Ask an Atheist. Be sure to check out FFRF's radio show and podcast, Freethought Radio, on Thursday. Dan Barker and I will be interviewing Muhammad Syed, who is co-founder of Ex-Muslims of North America. And you can find out where to listen to Freethought Radio on our website at ffrf.org/radio. And thank you again, Kelda, so much for your time and activism. And Ron, thank you so much. And we'll see you next week for another live edition of FFRS Ask an Atheist.